Lucas's breath fogged in the cold night air as he adjusted his camera strap and stepped past the rusted gate of the abandoned amusement park. The hinges groaned as though protesting his intrusion, and the wind carried with it faint whispers that seemed to echo from the shadows. Every step forward felt like walking into a forgotten memory, the skeletal remains of rides looming like ghostly sentinels against the moonlit sky. The silence was deafening, broken only by the crunch of dead leaves beneath his boots and the occasional creak of decaying metal. But then he saw it. Rising from the darkness like an unwelcome guest was the circus tent. Its red and white stripes were weathered and stained, yet eerily vibrant under the pale light. The tent looked untouched by time, as if it were waiting for someone waiting for him. He approached cautiously, his heartbeat thudding in his ears. The closer he got, the more the air seemed to thicken, pressing against his chest like invisible hands. There was something wrong with this place, something he couldn't yet explain. As he reached the entrance, a faint jingling sound froze him in place. He turned his flashlight toward the ground and saw them, a pair of oversized clown shoes, scuffed and dirted, positioned neatly in front of the entrance flap. They weren't just old props discarded in haste, they were carefully placed, as though an unseen host was inviting him inside. Lucas hesitated, his gut screaming at him to turn back, but a strange compulsion tugged at his curiosity. He lifted the heavy canvas flap and stepped inside. The air within was stagnant and oppressive, carrying the faint scent of mildew mixed with something unsettlingly sweet. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing rows of decaying wooden bleachers circling a dusty central ring. Scattered across the ground were remnants of the circus, faded juggling pins, cracked masks, and deflated balloons that looked more like shriveled organs than toys. But what truly made his stomach twist was the silence. It was too quiet, as if the world outside had ceased to exist the moment he entered. Just as he moved deeper into the tent, the quiet was shattered by the faintest sound, a laugh. It wasn't a joyful laugh, but something distorted, fractured, like a record player dragging across a warped vinyl. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, wrapping around him like a sinister melody. His flashlight flickered, plunging him into brief darkness before sputtering back to life. That's when he saw it, shadows shifting along the edges of the tent. They weren't cast by his light, they moved independently, creeping closer, their shapes flickering like firelight. The laughter grew louder, joined by faint whispers, each voice overlapping and impossible to decipher. He spun around, his flashlight trembling in his hands, but there was nothing there, only the empty, suffocating vastness of the tent. Then he noticed something new. Near the center of the ring, a small pedestal had appeared. On it rested a single object illuminated by a spotlight that seemed to originate from nowhere. A balloon. Bright red, perfectly round, and impossibly pristine. Its string trailed down to the dusty ground, motionless despite the slight breeze that stirred the rest of the tent's interior. A name was scrawled on its surface in looping, childlike handwriting, Lucas. His breath hitched, and his legs felt rooted to the ground. How could his name be there? His thoughts raced, his mind clawing for answers. And then, almost imperceptibly, the balloon moved. It swayed gently at first, then rose higher, as though lifted by invisible hands. The whispers and laughter surged, growing more erratic, more malicious, as if the air itself were mocking him. Lucas stumbled back, his flashlight slipping from his grasp and clattering to the floor. He bent to retrieve it, and when he stood again, the balloon was gone. The whispers stopped. The laughter ceased. The silence returned, heavier and more suffocating than before. But now he wasn't alone. From somewhere in the darkness, a soft, rhythmic sound emerged, the unmistakable squeak of clown shoes walking across the dirt. Lucas's trembling hands gripped the flashlight as he forced himself to step further into the suffocating stillness of the tent. His breaths came in shallow gasps, echoing faintly in the oppressive silence. The faint squeak of clown shoes that had haunted him moments ago was gone, but the memory of it lingered, scratching at the edges of his sanity. He scanned the empty bleachers, his light catching glimpses of torn banners, faded posters, and long-forgotten remnants of the circus that had once been alive with joy. But as the beam swept across one of the posts, it landed on something that made his blood run cold. It was an old, black-and-white photograph, pinned to the wood by a rusted nail. The image showed a troupe of performers, clowns, acrobats, and a ringmaster, all frozen in time with eerie, unnatural smiles. Lucas felt a pang of unease as he studied the photo more closely. There was something wrong with the faces, something he couldn't quite place. Their eyes seemed too dark, their smiles too wide, as though the expressions had been forced upon them. But what truly made him freeze was a figure standing at the edge of the group, a clown holding a balloon. On the balloon, faint but unmistakable, was written, "Welcome back, Lucas." His chest tightened. How could this be possible? He had never been here before. Or had he? His mind raced, clawing at fragments of memories long buried. A wave of nausea washed over him as an image surfaced, a child's hand, small and trembling, clutching a similar balloon. The laughter of a crowd filled his ears, distorted and distant, like a dream he couldn't quite remember. The image grew sharper. A woman, his grandmother, pulling him away from the tent, her voice frantic. "Never go near them, Lucas. They always come back for their own." The memory hit him like a punch to the gut, and he stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a discarded unicycle. He hadn't thought of that day in years. He had been a child, barely old enough to understand her words, but now they echoed with terrifying clarity. The photo before him wasn't just a relic of the past. It was a taunt, a warning that this place had been waiting for him all along. As he reached for the photo, the nail holding it creaked, almost as if resisting his touch. His fingers brushed the edge of the brittle paper, and a sudden, sharp pain shot through his hand. Pulling it back, he found a fresh cut on his palm, though there was no sign of what had caused it. Blood dripped to the ground, vanishing into the dusty floor as though the tent itself were drinking it. Then he saw it, etched into the wood behind where the photo had been. A series of names carved in uneven, jagged letters, their edges darkened as if burned into the surface. His eyes scanned the list, each name sending a shiver down his spine. Margaret, Peter, Isabel. The last name was incomplete, the letters freshly carved. Luke. His flashlight flickered violently, and the whispers returned, louder this time, overlapping and chaotic. They spoke his name, fragmented and distorted. Lucas. "We've been waiting." He whipped around, expecting to see someone. Anyone, but there was only darkness. He backed toward the center of the tent, his pulse hammering in his ears. Suddenly, the smell of something familiar flooded his senses. Lavender and mothballs, his grandmother's scent. His knees buckled under the weight of the memory. She had always warned him, hadn't she? She had known this place held something evil, something hungry. But why hadn't she told him the full truth? Why had she hidden this from him? As he steadied himself, his flashlight beam landed on something new, a small object half buried in the dirt. Kneeling, he unearthed it with trembling hands. A clock pendant, its surface tarnished but still recognizable. It was his grandmother's. He remembered it well, the way she would hold it to her chest during moments of prayer, her thumb brushing over its surface like a talisman. The pendant began to vibrate in his hand, faintly at first, then more violently. He felt a searing heat against his palm as the whispers grew into screams, the air around him thick with an oppressive, malevolent energy. He tried to drop the pendant, but it clung to his hand as if fused to his skin. His surroundings blurred, the walls of the tent warping and twisting like a nightmare come to life. Then, as abruptly as it began, everything stopped. The pendant fell from his hand to the ground, its chain coiled like a serpent. Lucas staggered backward, gasping for air. In the silence that followed, a single sound emerged, a child's laugh, soft and chilling, coming from deep within the shadows. He turned toward the source, his legs heavy with dread, as the laughter echoed again, growing louder, closer. There, at the edge of the ring, stood a small figure holding a balloon. It tilted its head, the darkness concealing its face, and whispered in a voice both innocent and menacing, "Welcome back." Lucas stood frozen, his breath shallow and his body trembling. The small figure holding the balloon disappeared into the darkness, leaving him alone with an unbearable weight pressing against his chest. His flashlight flickered weakly, and in its dim, erratic glow, he noticed something new in the center of the ring, a large, antique wooden chest, its edges adorned with faded gold trim. It hadn't been there before. The air around it seemed thicker, humming faintly with an energy that prickled his skin. He hesitated, every fiber of his being screaming to turn back, to leave this cursed place. But something deep inside compelled him forward, an invisible force pulling him toward the chest. The whispers returned, low and guttural, growing louder with every step he took. When he reached the chest, he saw an inscription carved into the wood, the letters jagged and crude, "Choose or be chosen." As he leaned in closer, the chest creaked open on its own, revealing its contents. Two objects resting side by side, bathed in an eerie, unnatural light. On the left was a small, pristine photograph of his grandmother holding him as a child, her face glowing with warmth and love. On the right was a cracked mirror, its surface dark and cloudy, but faintly reflecting his distorted image. A voice, soft but commanding, echoed in his mind, one binds you to us. One sets you free. The weight of the decision pressed down on him, heavier than anything he had ever experienced. The photograph radiated a comforting warmth, a reminder of the safety and love he had once known. But there was something sinister about the way it seemed too perfect, too untouched by time. The mirror, on the other hand, filled him with an overwhelming dread, as if staring into it would mean losing a part of himself forever. Then the whispers shifted. They were no longer faceless voices, but familiar ones, his grandmother calling his name in a pleading tone, his own voice, fractured and distorted, begging him to stop. He clutched his head, his mind reeling as the whispers grew into screams. The tent seemed to close in around him, the walls pulsating like a living organism. From the corner of his eye, he saw movement. Shadows began to coalesce around the chest, taking shape as twisted figures. Clowns with elongated limbs and grotesque, painted faces, their smiles unnaturally wide. They circled him, their laughter low and menacing, their hollow eyes locked onto him. One of them extended a skeletal hand, its bony fingers pointing toward the chest. Lucas felt his knees buckle under the weight of their gaze. He knew he couldn't escape this moment. His choice would determine his fate. But what did they mean by binds you and sets you free? Was the photograph a trap, a way to keep him tethered to this place forever? Was the mirror an escape, or would it pull him into a darkness he couldn't return from? As he reached out with trembling fingers, his thoughts raced. Could he sacrifice the memory of his grandmother, the only piece of comfort he had left, for a chance at freedom? Or would looking into the mirror mean losing not just his sanity, but his soul? The laughter of the clowns grew louder, their movements becoming more erratic and frenzied, as if feeding off his fear. The air around him thickened, making it harder to breathe. Just as his hand hovered over the photograph, the mirror flashed with a sudden burst of light, revealing a horrific vision. His own reflection, dressed as a clown, his eyes hollow and his face painted with a grotesque smile. He yanked his hand back, panic surging through his veins. The figures around him began to close in, their laughter now deafening. He had no time to think. With a desperate cry, he reached into the chest and grabbed. Everything went silent. The whispers stopped. The figures froze. The object in his hand, whether photograph or mirror, burned against his skin, filling him with an indescribable sensation of both relief and dread. But the silence didn't last. A single voice, low and dripping with malice, echoed through the tent. You've chosen well, or poorly. Time will tell. The chest slammed shut, and the ground beneath him began to tremble. The tent's walls warped and twisted, the shadows around him shifting into monstrous forms. Lucas stumbled backward, clutching the object as though his life depended on it. And then, as the tent seemed on the verge of collapsing in on itself, everything went black. The whispers were gone, the laughter silenced. Lucas found himself outside, lying on the cold, damp grass, the night air sharp against his skin. But something was wrong. In his hand, the object glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. And from deep within the tent, now little more than a crumbling ruin, he heard it again, the faint, distant squeak of clown shoes, growing louder. Lucas stood outside the tent, his hands trembling as he gripped the object he had taken. The chill of the night bit into his skin, but the icy dread pooling in his chest was far worse. The world around him seemed eerily still, the distant hum of the city muffled, as though he had stepped into a realm disconnected from reality. The object in his hand, warm, pulsing faintly like a living thing, drew his gaze. Its glow dimmed and brightened in a slow rhythm, like a heartbeat, each pulse sending a wave of unease through his body. A rustling sound broke the silence, sharp and sudden, making Lucas spin around. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, but it revealed only the skeletal remains of the amusement park. Yet he could feel something watching him, hidden just beyond the reach of the light. The whispers began again, faint at first, rising from the edges of the shadows. They were fragmented, distorted, like a broken radio tuning into long-forgotten voices. Lucas, the whispers called, soft and elongated, dragging his name through the air like a predator savoring its prey. He froze, his breath caught in his throat. The voices came from everywhere, circling him, growing louder with every passing second. They carried hints of familiarity, tones and cadences that stirred buried memories. One voice, impossibly close, whispered in his ear, "You brought us back." He stumbled back, his flashlight flickering as though the shadows were reaching out to snuff it out. The world around him seemed to shift, the landscape twisting unnaturally. The carousel, broken and rusted, began to creak and turn, its haunting melody playing slowly, discordantly, as if dragged from the depths of some forgotten nightmare. The horses, chipped and eyeless, seemed to watch him as they moved, their heads turning slightly when his gaze landed on them. The whispers turned to laughter, high-pitched, childlike, but wrong. It echoed through the park, bouncing off the empty structures, growing louder until it was almost unbearable. Lucas turned to run, but his legs felt heavy, as though the ground itself was holding him in place. His flashlight flickered one final time before going dark, plunging him into shadow. Then the voices stopped. The silence was so sudden, so complete, that it felt like the world had been muted. Lucas stood in the oppressive quiet, his heart hammering against his ribs. And then he heard it, the faintest sound, almost imperceptible but unmistakable, the soft shuffle of something moving behind him. He turned slowly, his body stiff with fear. In the darkness, faint shapes began to emerge, elongated, shadowy figures slinking toward him. They moved unnaturally, their bodies bending and twisting in ways that defied logic. Their faces were obscured, but their eyes glowed faintly, pinpricks of malevolent light that pierced the darkness. One figure stepped forward, its form solidifying as it neared. It was a clown, its face pale and painted with a grotesque grin that stretched far beyond what should be humanly possible. Its eyes were empty sockets, black holes that seemed to draw in the faint glow of the object in Lucas's hand. It raised a finger, long and spindly, pointing directly at him. "You took what was ours," it hissed, its voice layered with others, a cacophony of anger and sorrow. "Now you owe us." Lucas stumbled backward, clutching the object tightly. The whispers returned, sharper and more aggressive, filling his mind with fragmented images. A circus audience screaming in terror, flames consuming the tent, and the painted faces of clowns twisted in agony. He fell to his knees, the images overwhelming him, his head pounding with the weight of their fury. The ground beneath him began to pulse in rhythm with the object in his hand. The shadows swirled around him, creeping closer, their laughter echoing in his ears. A voice, deep and resonant, rose above the cacophony. "You can't run. You can't hide. You belong to us now." Lucas looked up, his vision blurred by tears of terror. The shadows had fully encircled him, their forms solidifying into grotesque, nightmarish versions of circus performers. The clown with the impossibly wide grin crouched in front of him, tilting its head as it whispered, "Make it right, Lucas. Or stay with us forever." The object in his hand grew unbearably hot, forcing him to drop it. As it hit the ground, the glow intensified, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like flames. The figures recoiled slightly, their forms flickering, but their laughter never ceased. Lucas realized with dawning horror that the object was both his anchor and his curse. Whatever he had chosen, it had bound him to this nightmare. In a desperate attempt to escape, Lucas scrambled to his feet and ran. The shadows screamed in unison, their voices chasing him as he fled through the twisted remains of the park. The carousel spun faster, its eerie tune growing louder, and the world around him seemed to warp and stretch, the exit to the park always just out of reach. As he ran, a single whisper cut through the chaos, clear and deliberate, "You can never leave, Lucas. The show must go on." Lucas ran blindly through the twisted remnants of the park, his breath hitching with every step. The night seemed alive now, the darkness pulsating with unseen movement. The carousel's haunting tune followed him, growing louder and more erratic as though the music itself were mocking his panic. His flashlight, now flickering sporadically, barely illuminated the path ahead. But even in its weak glow, he could see shapes darting at the edge of his vision, shadows that moved unnaturally, with limbs that stretched and twisted like distorted puppets. As he stumbled into a clearing, the sound of his own name stopped him cold. "Lucas," it was faint, almost a whisper carried on the wind, but it was enough to root him in place. He turned slowly, his eyes darting into the void behind him. The shadows that had been chasing him were gone, but the oppressive air remained, heavy and stifling. "Lucas," the voice came again, clearer this time. His heart clenched as he recognized it. It was his grandmother's voice, soft and gentle, the way she used to speak to him as a child when he was afraid of the dark. "Come here, meu querido." Tears welled in his eyes, a confusing mix of terror and longing. He spun around, desperate to find her, but all he saw was the endless expanse of the abandoned park. Then, the carousel lights flickered to life in the distance, casting a sickly yellow glow. Beneath its garish illumination, a figure emerged, shrouded in shadows but undeniably familiar. It was his grandmother, her silhouette unmistakable. She held out her arms, beckoning him closer. "Grandma," Lucas whispered, his voice trembling. He took a hesitant step forward. The air around him seemed to shift, becoming warmer, more inviting. The scent of lavender and mothballs, the scent of her, filled his senses, grounding him in a memory of safety and comfort. "It's me, Lucas. I'm so scared." But something wasn't right. The shadows near the carousel flickered unnaturally, as though they were alive, twisting and writhing. The figure of his grandmother didn't move, her form unnervingly still except for the faint sway of her arms. He stopped in his tracks, doubt clawing at the edges of his mind. "Grandma," he called again, louder this time. The figure's head tilted sharply, too sharply, as if it were a puppet on strings. The warmth in the air turned ice cold, and the comforting lavender scent soured, replaced by the stench of decay. "Lucas," the voice repeated, but it was no longer hers. It was layered now, fragmented and distorted, like dozens of voices speaking in unison. The shadows around the carousel surged forward, consuming the figure entirely. Lucas stumbled back, his pulse hammering as the whispers began again, louder and more insistent. "Do you see, Lucas?" they hissed. "Do you remember?" The world around him twisted violently, and Lucas fell to his knees, clutching his head. The whispers grew into a cacophony, bombarding him with fragments of images. His childhood self clutching a red balloon, the tattered circus tent looming in the background, his grandmother's terrified face as she dragged him away. But there was something else, something he had blocked out. A clown, its face painted in garish colors, kneeling in front of him with a twisted grin. The whispers coalesced into a single booming voice. "You were always meant to return." Lucas's surroundings dissolved into a warped version of the circus tent. The bleachers were filled now, but not with people. Shadows sat in rows, their hollow eyes watching him intently. In the center of the ring stood a warped mirror, its cracked surface reflecting not his face, but his deepest fears. As he stared into it, the image began to shift, showing him things that made his stomach churn. His grandmother reaching for him from within the mirror, her face pale and streaked with black tears. Himself as a child, trapped in the embrace of the clown. And finally, his own reflection, painted with the grotesque smile of a performer in this horrifying circus. The mirror whispered to him, its voice slithering into his mind, "You can end this, Lucas. All it takes is one small step." The shadows in the bleachers began to laugh, a hideous sound that rattled his very bones. They leaned forward, their hollow eyes gleaming with anticipation. Lucas felt his knees give out, his body collapsing under the weight of their gaze. The temptation to give in was overwhelming. The laughter, the whispers, the mirror, they all spoke to his deepest fears, amplifying them until they felt insurmountable. "You can end this," the voice repeated, seductive and cruel. "Just give in. Let us make you whole." Lucas clawed at his own mind, desperate to silence the voice. "No," he screamed, his voice hoarse and cracking. The shadows surged closer, their twisted forms growing more defined, their laughter turning into a deafening roar. In that moment, Lucas realized the truth. The entity wasn't just feeding on his fear. It was offering him relief. It wanted him to surrender, to let go of the fight, to let the terror consume him. And for a brief, horrifying moment, he considered it. But then, a faint memory surfaced, cutting through the noise. His grandmother's voice, real and unbroken this time. "Fear will tempt you, Lucas, but it's never stronger than you. Remember that." He clung to that memory, letting it anchor him. He forced himself to stand, his legs trembling but determined. The shadows recoiled slightly, their forms flickering as he stepped closer to the mirror. Its surface rippled like water, the twisted image of himself staring back with that terrible clown smile. "I'm not yours," Lucas said, his voice steady despite the terror clawing at his chest. "You don't own me." The mirror's surface cracked violently, sending shards of light cascading across the ring. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by an ear-splitting shriek that seemed to tear the air itself. Lucas shielded his face as the shadows writhed and dissolved, their forms vanishing into the void. When he opened his eyes, the mirror was gone, and the tent was silent. But Lucas knew this wasn't the end. The temptation of fear had only begun its game. Lucas stood in the eerie silence of the ruined circus tent, his heart pounding as if it were trying to escape his chest. The oppressive darkness seemed to pull at the edges of his sanity, but he could feel something had shifted. The mirror was gone, the whispers had ceased, and yet the air was thick with anticipation. He clutched the glowing object he had taken from the chest earlier, its faint warmth now feeling like the only thing tethering him to reality. But he knew this wasn't over. The ground beneath him trembled, subtle at first, then violently, as if the earth itself were being ripped apart. From the center of the ring, the dirt began to swirl, forming a vortex that seemed to pull light and sound into its gaping maw. Lucas stumbled backward, his eyes locked on the churning void as an overwhelming sense of dread filled him. Then, from within the vortex, something began to emerge. At first, it was just a shape, indistinct, amorphous, and pulsating with a dark, otherworldly energy. But as it rose higher, the shape began to take form. A figure, impossibly tall and twisted, its limbs unnaturally elongated, its face obscured by a grotesque clown mask with an impossibly wide grin. The eyes behind the mask were empty voids, yet Lucas could feel their gaze piercing through him, stripping away every defense he had. The entity's voice echoed through the tent, deep and resonant, layered with countless whispers. "You've come so far, Lucas, but you've always known it would end here." Lucas took a step back, his hands trembling. What are you?" he managed to choke out, his voice barely above a whisper. The entity tilted its head, the grin on its mask seeming to stretch even wider. "I am the ringmaster, the collector of what is owed. And you, Lucas, are the final act." The air grew colder, frost forming on the ground and creeping up the wooden bleachers. Lucas's breath came out in visible puffs, each one shorter as the oppressive energy seemed to draw the life out of him. The glowing object in his hand pulsed violently, its rhythm matching his racing heartbeat. "I didn't ask for this," Lucas shouted, his voice cracking with fear. "I don't belong here." The ringmaster laughed, a sound that reverberated through the air like shattered glass. "You've always belonged here. You were chosen long ago, marked by those who came before you." The ground beneath Lucas shifted again, and he fell to his knees, the glowing object slipping from his grasp. It landed in the dirt, its light dimming as the ringmaster's towering figure loomed closer. The air around him crackled with a dark energy, and shadows began to rise from the ground, forming grotesque faces that twisted and screamed in agony. Lucas's mind raced, every instinct telling him to run, but his body refused to move. His gaze locked onto the glowing object, now flickering like a dying ember. The ringmaster extended a hand, long and clawed, pointing directly at Lucas. "It's time to take your place among them. You cannot resist." But then a memory surged through Lucas's mind, a fragment of his grandmother's voice, clear and resolute. "There is always a way, Lucas. Even in the darkest places, there is light." Gritting his teeth, Lucas forced himself to reach for the glowing object, his fingers brushing against its warm surface. As his hand closed around it, the light flared, brighter than before, illuminating the tent in a blinding radiance. The shadows recoiled, their screams echoing through the void. The ringmaster hissed, its voice now tinged with rage. "You think you can defy me? You are nothing without your fear." Lucas stood, the glowing object pulsating in his hand, its warmth flooding him with a renewed strength. He locked eyes, or rather, the empty voids where eyes should have been, with the ringmaster. "You don't own me," he said, his voice steady despite the terror clawing at his chest. "You're nothing but a shadow, feeding on fear. And I'm done being afraid." The ringmaster roared, a sound that shook the entire tent. The vortex at its feet swirled faster, pulling in debris and shadows alike. The glowing object in Lucas's hand began to change, its surface cracking to reveal a blinding, golden light. He felt its power surge through him, and with a cry, he hurled it toward the ringmaster. The object struck the entity, exploding into a brilliant flash that engulfed the tent. The shadows screamed as they were consumed by the light, their forms disintegrating into nothingness. The ringmaster's mask shattered, revealing a face that was not a face, an endless void, swirling with darkness and despair. As the light spread, the vortex collapsed, and the tent began to crumble. Lucas was thrown backward, the force of the explosion knocking the wind out of him. He hit the ground hard, his vision swimming as the world around him dissolved into chaos. When he opened his eyes, the tent was gone. The carousel was still, its haunting tune silenced. The air was calm, and the oppressive energy had lifted. But Lucas knew it wasn't over. In the dirt where the glowing object had fallen, a faint shimmer remained, like the last embers of a dying fire. The silence was broken by a single whisper, faint and distant, but unmistakable. "The show must go on." Lucas stood in the hollow emptiness where the tent had once loomed, his body trembling, his breath ragged. The faint shimmer on the ground pulsed weakly, its light fading with each passing second. Though the oppressive shadows and the ringmaster's grotesque form were gone, the air around him felt thick, as if the void itself were watching, waiting. He staggered to his feet, his legs unsteady, and glanced at the ruined amusement park around him. The rides were motionless, the silence deafening. Yet something lingered, a presence, faint but unmistakable, that sent chills coursing through his veins. A sharp, metallic creak shattered the stillness, and Lucas whipped around to see the carousel begin to turn again. Its chipped and eyeless horses bobbed up and down in a slow, deliberate rhythm, the eerie calliope music sputtering to life, each note fractured and discordant. But there was no wind, no power source, only the unseen force that seemed to be pulling the strings of this hellish performance. As Lucas backed away, his foot struck something in the dirt. He looked down to find a mask, one of the ringmaster's grotesque clown masks, its paint chipped and its smile frozen in a sinister sneer. He felt an unnatural pull as he stared at it, as though it were alive, whispering to him in a language just beyond his comprehension. He bent down reluctantly, picking it up with trembling hands. The moment his fingers touched the mask, the world around him shifted violently. The carousel's music grew louder, faster, until it was a cacophony of maddening tones. The park dissolved into darkness, and Lucas found himself back inside the tent. But this time it was whole, pristine even. The bleachers were full, occupied by shadowy figures whose hollow eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. They stared at him in unison, unblinking, their forms flickering like dying flames. In the center of the ring stood the ringmaster, its shattered mask restored, its elongated body towering over him. The air vibrated with its presence, and the darkness seemed to ripple around it like a living thing. Lucas clenched his fists, the mask in his hand feeling heavier, almost as though it were sinking into his skin. "Did you think it would be that easy?" The ringmaster's voice boomed, layered and filled with a venomous malice. "You cannot destroy what you don't understand. The light you unleashed was nothing but a spark." And now it paused, tilting its head as though savoring his fear. The curtain rises for the final act. The bleachers erupted in applause, slow, deliberate claps that echoed unnaturally, each one sending a jolt of terror through Lucas's body. The shadows leaned forward, their hollow eyes locking onto him, their grins wide and unnatural. "You can't control me," Lucas shouted, his voice cracking but filled with defiance. "I don't belong here. I'll never belong here." The ringmaster's grin widened, impossibly so, its teeth sharp and gleaming. "You've belonged to us from the moment you stepped into this place. You cannot escape what you are." Lucas felt the mask grow warmer in his hand, the whispers from it becoming clearer, louder. They were his own voice now, fractured and pleading, begging him to put it on. He clutched his head, his mind spinning as the shadows around him began to writhe and contort, their forms growing taller, their laughter rising to a fever pitch. The ringmaster stepped closer, the ground beneath its feet cracking and splintering with each movement. It extended a long, clawed hand, pointing at Lucas's chest. "The choice is yours," it hissed. "Accept your place among us, or fade into nothingness. But choose quickly, for the show will go on, with or without you." His hands, its pull growing stronger, almost irresistible. But he remembered the glowing object, the warmth it had given him, the fleeting strength it had provided. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the cacophony around him, and focused on the memory of his grandmother's voice. "Even in the darkest places, there is light." He opened his eyes, his gaze locking onto the ringmaster. "I'm not afraid of you," he said, his voice steady despite the terror clawing at him. "You don't control me." The ringmaster roared, the shadows around it surging forward like a tidal wave. The tent quaked, the bleachers collapsing as the shadowy figures screamed in rage. Lucas felt the mask grow unbearably hot, burning into his skin, but he didn't let go. Instead, he raised it high and hurled it at the ringmaster with all his strength. The mask struck the entity's chest, and the world erupted in light. The shadows screamed as they were consumed, their forms disintegrating into nothingness. The ringmaster's body twisted and contorted, its mask shattering into 1,000 pieces. The tent began to collapse, the walls folding inward, the ground beneath Lucas cracking open. He fell, tumbling into the void, his mind flooded with images of the park, the tent, the shadows. But then, just as suddenly, it all stopped. Lucas awoke on the cold, damp ground outside the park. The night was quiet, the stars above shining brightly as if nothing had happened. He sat up, his body aching, and looked around. The park was gone, no rides, no tent, just an empty field overgrown with weeds. In his hand, he found the faint shimmer of light from the glowing object. It was no longer warm, no longer pulsing. It was just a shard of glass, cracked and lifeless. But as he stared at it, he felt a strange sense of relief, as though he had passed a test he didn't know he was taking. From the distance, faint laughter echoed, a child's laugh, soft and fleeting. Lucas turned toward the sound, his heart sinking. The show was over, but the curtain would rise again. Lucas sat in the field, his hands trembling as he clutched the shard of glass. The world around him was eerily quiet, the once haunted amusement park now nothing more than a barren expanse of weeds and rusted debris. The stars above glimmered faintly, indifferent to the horrors he had just endured. He felt the weight of the silence pressing down on him, not the comforting kind, but a silence that carried secrets too dreadful to speak. As he rose to his feet, the shard in his hand seemed lifeless now, its glow extinguished, its surface cracked and dull. Yet, even without its light, Lucas couldn't bring himself to discard it. It felt like a piece of him had been carved out and left behind in that cursed tent, and this shard was the only proof that it had ever existed. He slipped it into his pocket, its edges sharp against his fingers, and began walking toward the distant road. But as he moved, the air seemed heavier, thick with an unseen presence. The wind, which had been still moments before, began to pick up, carrying faint whispers that brushed against his ears like icy breath. The voices were indistinct, yet familiar. They weren't the malicious whispers of the shadows or the mocking laughter of the ringmaster. These were quieter, sadder, as though mourning something lost. He stopped in his tracks, scanning the darkness around him. The field stretched endlessly, yet the shadows seemed to shift unnaturally at its edges, pooling in corners where there should have been none. He thought of the bleachers in the tent, of the hollow-eyed figures who had watched him with such intensity. Were they truly gone, or were they still here, watching from the edges of his vision? "Lucas," a soft voice called, faint but distinct. It sent a chill down his spine. He turned sharply, his eyes darting to the source. In the distance, he saw a faint figure standing beneath a skeletal tree. It was hard to make out in the darkness, but its silhouette was unmistakable, a small child holding a balloon. "No," Lucas muttered, backing away. "You're not real. You can't be real." The child didn't move, its form eerily still except for the gentle sway of the balloon in the wind. The whispers grew louder, swirling around him, fragments of sentences he couldn't fully understand. "You belong. The show never ends." He clutched his head, squeezing his eyes shut. The memories of the tent surged back, vivid and relentless. The ringmaster's grin, the shadow's screams, the mirror reflecting his deepest fears. He opened his eyes, but the figure was gone. In its place, the balloon floated freely, drifting toward him in slow, deliberate movements. Its surface shimmered faintly in the moonlight, and as it drew closer, he saw words scrawled across it in looping, childlike handwriting. "See you soon." Lucas turned and ran, his footsteps pounding against the uneven ground. The whispers followed him, growing louder, more urgent. His mind raced with questions. Was it over? Had he escaped? Or had the ringmaster's final words, "The show must go on," been more than a threat? When he finally reached the road, he collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. The lights of a distant car appeared, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he felt a sliver of hope. The vehicle slowed as it approached, and the driver, a kind-looking older man, rolled down the window. "You okay, son?" the man asked, his voice warm and concerned. Lucas hesitated, unsure of what to say. How could he explain what had happened without sounding insane? I just need to get out of here," he finally said, his voice shaking. The man nodded, gesturing for him to get in. As Lucas settled into the passenger seat, he glanced back toward the field. It was empty again, the shadows gone, the balloon nowhere to be seen. But the unease in his chest refused to fade. The car rumbled forward, the road stretching into the night. The man tried to make small talk, but Lucas barely responded, his mind trapped in a cycle of replaying the night's events. As they drove, he reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the shard of glass. It felt colder now, almost as though it had absorbed the chill of the void he had left behind. "Strange night, isn't it?" the man said suddenly, breaking the silence. Lucas turned to him, his unease growing. "Yeah," he replied cautiously. The man smiled, but there was something unsettling about it, a slight curl at the edges, too wide, too familiar. Lucas's heart sank as the man's voice deepened, layered with an echo that sent a jolt of terror through him. "The show's not over, Lucas. It's just intermission." Lucas's breath caught in his throat as the man turned to face him fully. His face was no longer kind. It was painted white with grotesque red streaks forming a grin that stretched impossibly wide. His hollow eyes locked onto Lucas, and the car seemed to dissolve around them, the world twisting back into the familiar darkness of the tent. The ringmaster's laughter echoed all around, deafening and triumphant, as Lucas realized the truth. He hadn't escaped. The show wasn't over. It never would be. And as the shadows closed in once more, the last thing he heard was the faint squeak of clown shoes approaching, accompanied by the chilling words, "The audience is waiting.